I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Today we're reading from the book of Hebrews, chapter 3, and let's focus on verses 16 through 19. For who heard and rebelled? Wasn't it really all who came out of Egypt under Moses? And with whom was he provoked for 40 years? Was it not with those who sinned, whose bodies fell in the desert? And to whom did he swear that they would not enter his rest, if not those who disobeyed? So we see that they were unable to enter because of unbelief. Hebrews chapter 3, verses 16 through 19. I love mountain biking. I love the equipment and the trails, love the mountains, love the magazines about mountain biking. I love power bars and the Camelback full of Gatorade. One problem, I don't actually like to ride the mountain bikes. Several years ago, my extreme friends bought mountain bikes, and so did I. And I was really excited about joining this whole world of extreme sports culture until they took me out on a trail ride. You see, screaming down narrow trails, inches between tree limbs and the ends of my handlebars, that was no treat for me. It terrified me to some extent. And it was my third fall that really convinced me that my new Gary Fisher bike had just become a monument to impetuousness on permanent display in my garage. You see, it's easy to get into the culture of mountain biking, but you have to be committed to be an actual mountain biker, at least at the level that these guys took me out on. Similarly, it can be easy to get into Christian culture, but it's often difficult to live the life of a Christian. And I'm not talking about our salvation, which is by God's grace alone, through our faith in Jesus alone. I'm talking about living out your faith once you have received salvation. You see, following Jesus is more than praying a prayer, or signing a card, or lifting a hand, or walking down an aisle. You see, those action items may be wonderful methods of crossing the line of faith. But the acts themselves are only external indicators of an inward transformation. And Jesus calls us to a life of faith and service, not just a one-time decision. So to paraphrase the old preacher D.L. Moody, new believers are not to be counted, they are to be weighed. So if your last act of following Jesus was your decision to follow Him, well then maybe it's time for you to examine your life to see whether or not the gospel that you received was the real thing. You see, we're not saved by faith and works, rather we're saved by faith that works. And salvation is less about a moment of decision and more about generating momentum for a disciple. Belief is a starting line, it's not a finish line. And for the Israelites, simply leaving Egypt didn't mean that they were ready to follow God in obedience. All but two men of that generation which left Egyptian bondage, all but two of them were unable to enter the promised land because of their unbelief. And similarly, salvation in this generation only comes through belief in the Messiah, Jesus. So simply leaving the world and attending a church is not necessarily an indicator that we have entered into a saving relationship with Jesus. And so it never hurts to examine our spiritual lives just to make sure that we know the difference between leaving and following. You see, the indicator that we have received the real thing is most often found in how we worship God during those desert seasons of our lives. Are you following Jesus, or are you merely following Him around? I'm Steve Wiggins, and this is the Groundworks Ministries podcast. Check us out at groundworksministries.com.